Valentine greetings from Hopalong Hollow. This is Jerry. It's hard to find a prettier cookie than this. unless it's this. And this is called Springerle. Springerle cookies are very special cookies, made with a very special dough. And the imprints in the cookies are also very incredible. Some of the cookie molds that you get are reproductions of 600-year-old molds from Bavaria, Switzerland, and the Alsace region of France. So they're not only beautiful cookies, but they have quite a wonderful history, a pictorial history, as you can see. This is an Elizabethan spinner reproduction. The original would have been hand carved out of wood, and these are reproductions made with resin. They make beautiful imprints on your cookies. Just look at the tiny little details in this wood carving that are translated right onto the dough. If you look at the dough, you can even see the fur on the dog, the little puffs on the lady's sleeves and her buttons, the flax on the spinning wheel. It's really incredible. And the floor, the tiling on the floor. They're little works of art. So the trick is to keep that impression in the dough, and that all has to do with a couple things. Keeping the impression in the dough has to do with a couple things. One thing is that you need to let your cookies dry after you've imprinted them for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, because you want these to be really, really dried out. And these have been drying now for about 16 hours, but they're still a little bit damp on the bottom, and I want to get these completely dry before I try them in the oven. Another thing is the temperature that you cook at. If the oven is too hot, you're going to end up with something like this. I've lost the impression. The cookie has swelled up too much, and not only that, it's got toasted on all sides. It would taste just fine, but the whole idea of these cookies is the art involved in making it. Peculiar to this type of cookie is ammonium carbonate, or baker's ammonia. Another name for this is hartshorn. It's an old-time leavening agent. It supposedly produces an especially light and delicate texture for your cookies, and this is an exchange for using baking powder. But this is by no means baking powder. In fact, it's very, very different. When you open it up, you'll get a strong smell of ammonia, and even during the baking. Therefore, do not eat your raw dough, because the ammonia needs to bake out of the cookies. So it's very tempting to taste that dough, but you mustn't taste the dough until the ammonia is baked out of the cookie. You'll also notice in my flavoring, I used ground anise. Now, normally you would want to use an anise extract, but I didn't have any, so I ground my own, and it works out perfectly fine. It smells so good. Another thing you'll need to experiment with will be your cooking temperatures and your times. With normal cookies, you're going to bake them at a high temperature for about 10 to 12 minutes, but these are completely different. Your temperature is going to be very low on your oven, from 255 to 300, and sometimes even lower, depending on the thinness or the thickness of your cookie. So you might have to experiment with a couple cookies that didn't turn out so well as far as the imprint. I've experimented with different oven temperatures, and here's what I have found out. These cookies were cooked at 255, and as you can see, they lost the impression by rising too much, and they also were getting a little bit burned. So I lowered the oven to 225, and we had a little better success with these, but this one also started to raise too much and lost some of the impression. But I also covered these with aluminum foil to keep them from browning too much on the top. This one turned out pretty nicely. This was baked at 225, covered with aluminum to keep it from browning too much on the top. And it only lost a small bit of the impression. And I think this one is pretty nice. But this one was the best, even though it did start to get a little toasty on the top. The impression stayed in the cookie. This one I baked with the door slightly ajar at 225 with aluminum foil over the top. And so, a little golden brown on the bottom, which is what you want. But I think what I'm going to do to really keep the impression in the cookie is dry it for the full 24 hours. So I think that is kind of what's going on here. These cookies really should be dried for a very long time. So these cookies are going to dry for about another, 8 hours before I actually put these in the oven. So basically, a Springerle is a German biscuit made with flour, sugar, eggs, and anise. It's an embossed cookie. Now, the historical molds date as far back as the 14th century, and usually they were religious scenes from the Old Testament, and they were used for religious occasions, but eventually all sorts of other motifs came into the picture, and farm life, nature, flowers, Christmas, Easter, rabbits, farm animals, all of them were made into these beautiful Springerle molds. Now, these are just as beautiful if you put dye on them as not, but I'm just going to lightly touch them. I don't want them to be have too much color, just a hint of color using food coloring, food dyes, just barely. I want the color to be just barely there. And I'm going to paint half of them. I think I like them better without color, just as an embossed cookie. Really gorgeous. We just covered the art of Springerle, which is a German and Swiss baking art form. I think it's an art form anyway. We're going to talk about another German and Swiss art form, and that is something I know a little bit about because I've done it for over 30 years, and that is the art of Scherenschnitte. And in particular, we're going to talk about Pennsylvania Dutch, which is Pennsylvania German, Valentines, Liebesbrief, which is a Valentine. Liebesbrief means love, love letter. And the Pennsylvania Germans were famous for their beautiful Valentines, hand-cut Valentines. A Liebesbrief is a love letter. It was said to originate with the Romans, as so many things did. The legend has it that a saint called Valentine, who was beheaded in the year 270 for his faith, became friends with the jailer's daughter. And on the eve before his fateful day, he sent her a farewell note and signed it, "From your Valentine." So the loving farewell note became known as a Valentine, and throughout history, the love note mingled with the Valentine, especially in German history. And in many cases, the Valentine was sent to a beloved as a marriage proposal. This is a perfect example of a piece that could have been sent as a marriage proposal. Now, the paper was folded many times. The design, the image, was drawn onto the paper, meticulously cut out with either a knife or a tiny scissor. And then when you open it up, something like a doily, except all hand cut, you would have a beautiful image, such as this one. Then each one of these little sections would have been painted. Then each one of these little hearts, there would be a written message. My dearly beloved, how I pine for you. Your beauty is like a rose. Your eyes are like the sky. And then written somewhere in here would be asking for their hand in marriage. Of course, this would all be written in German. Valentine would then be folded up again, put in a small envelope, sealed with wax, and delivered to the intended. The customs that I'm describing are applied to the Pennsylvania Deutsch, or the Germans that settled in America along the areas of New York, South Carolina, New Jersey, Maryland, but most of all Pennsylvania, which is why they were called the Pennsylvania Deutsch or the Pennsylvania Dutch. This was the early 17th and 18th centuries. And Scherenschnitte, which is this art form, once again, was a very prolific among the Pennsylvania Germans, and is still practiced to this day. As I mentioned, I have done this for a long, long time. The process is as follows. Using a piece of parchment paper, which is the paper I like because it's strong, yet easy to cut through. I begin by drawing a design on my paper. Now, if I want a mirror image, such as a Valentine, I'm going to fold my paper in half. So here you can see half of a heart, and I've begun to cut into it. Now, generally, scissors are used for paper cutting, but I also use a knife. So I'm using a very sharp, razor-sharp X-Acto knife, and a knife is likely what would have been used in the past. A very sharp razor knife would have been used to cut intricate designs into the paper. The design is drawn so that as you're cutting it, nothing is going to fall apart. In other words, you're not going to be cutting off little leaves and stems and pieces on these tulips and vines, because as you can see, everything is connected somehow. So this has a lot to do with being able to design. So everything here is connected so that when you open it up, there you have one sheet of paper. And then this beautiful paper cutting would have been painted, made into a beautiful Valentine. This would have been a quite elaborate Valentine, but the one that I painted. So here you have the paper cutting, rather elaborately done. And instead of making this into a Valentine, I actually made this one into a house blessing. But it would have been a beautiful Valentine for someone, or a marriage certificate, or even a birth announcement. And the Pennsylvania Dutch also used a lot of common motifs in their work. They used a lot of tulips, representing the three tulips, the Trinity. They used a lot of peacocks, angels, and obviously they used a lot of hearts. So, Liebesbrief, a Pennsylvania Dutch Valentine. So today we've been to Germany, we've been to Switzerland, we've been to Pennsylvania, and now we're in England because we're having coffee with Shakespeare. Why are we not having tea with Shakespeare? Well, we're having coffee with Shakespeare because I just happened to find these wonderful, wonderful cups. So today, instead of having tea, we're having coffee. And we're having coffee with Shakespeare. And that's because I found these wonderful, wonderful cups. These are demi-tasse cups. And demi-tasse is nothing more than a very small cup of coffee served generally after dinner, after a meal, and specifically after dinner so as not to keep you up all night. It's a very small cup, sometimes a very strong cup of coffee. So these wonderful little cups have Shakespearean buildings inside the cup. This is Mason's Court. And on the bottom of the cups, Shakespeare Land, made in England. I have no idea of the age of these cups. This is the blacksmith's forge. And the company that made it, it says Hanley, established in 1880. So obviously, and most likely sold at a tourist attraction somewhere near Stratford-on-Avon or somewhere near Shakespeare Land, because it is called Shakespeare Land. But the interesting thing about these cups is they came with something else. They came with this wonderful photograph, it's a pretty old photograph too, of Anne Hathaway's cottage. And Anne Hathaway was Shakespeare's wife, someone you don't hear much about because there's very little that we know about her. So this looks like it was probably taken, the photograph, maybe in the 1960s or something like that, and probably sold as a memento or a souvenir. But what I really like on the frame are the little oak leaves and tiny, tiny acorns on the bottom. And on the back, it says, "In the garden of Anne Hathaway's cottage." So it got me to thinking about Anne Hathaway, the wife of Shakespeare. So I did a very small amount of research. There isn't a lot of information on her. I found several images, paintings of Anne Hathaway, but I don't know if any of them are accurate. I do know, however, that I like this one that I'm going to show you the best. I probably wouldn't call this a cottage myself because it was actually a 12-room farmhouse with extensive gardens. It belonged to the Hathaway family until 1846. We do know that Anne was born in 1556, married to Shakespeare in 1582. She outlived him by 7 years. They had 3 children, one of whom died in one of the plagues. Their son died in one of the bubonic plagues of the time, and there were 2 surviving daughters. She died herself in 1623. About the relationship between them is speculation. There simply is not very much information about whether it was a good marriage or romantic marriage or anything of the sort. However, In his will, Shakespeare bequeathed his wife the second best bed with the furniture, which sounds a little bit like a slight, because who got the first best bed? Well, apparently in those days, if you were wealthy, a bed was an elaborate affair, and generally the best bed in the house was saved for the guests. And so the best bed in the house would probably have gone to the daughters who were expected to care for their mother in her old age. Now you would think that Shakespeare, one of the greatest writers in history, and the writer of Romeo and Juliet, among many, many love sonnets to his credit, would have written something about his wife, Anne Hathaway. But the only thing that we have that could have been written by him is this little bit. To my fancy given, to rate her charms, I'd call them heaven. For thou a mortal made of clay, angels must love Anne Hathaway. So she hath a way, so to control, to rapture the imprisoned soul, and sweetest heaven on earth display, that to be heaven, Anne Hathaway. She hath a way, Anne Hathaway, to be heaven's self, Anne hath a way. The problem is, it's actually attributed to Charles Gibbon in 1769 for a Shakespeare festival. So we do not have any love sonnets written by Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway. But let's get back to our coffee, our demi-tasse of the day, because we are wondering if Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway would have even drunk coffee. In the mid-1600s, coffee was actually promoted as an herbal remedy and an invigorating elixir. And coffee houses sprang up all across England and America throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. I talked about this when I was talking about colonial America and the Boston Tea Party. But coffee actually was a luxury product, and coffee houses were places to discuss politics, current affairs, and philosophy. So you can imagine that Shakespeare most likely would have occupied himself with discussions with other playwrights and actors in a coffee house. You could purchase admission to a coffee house for a mere penny, and that would include a cup of coffee. So coffee houses became known as penny universities for all the enlightening conversation that was going on and all that you could learn. But I have a tendency to think that in Elizabethan England, women probably were not partakers of the coffee house. Likely not. But it is interesting to think of Shakespeare sitting in, drinking a cup of demi-tasse in a coffee shop. Let me give you another look at these darling, darling cups. When I bought these, I bought them online. I saw them online, and I thought they were regular size cups. I had no idea they were tiny little demi-tasse cups. They were not advertised as demi-tasse cups, but I am so glad that they are, because it gave me a chance to do this video. If anyone knows about this company, let us know, because I've not ever heard of this. I can't read the upper text. Mystic something and Hanley, established in 1880, and Shakespeare Land and made in England. That's as much as I can make out. And some of you that live in England or you travel to England, this is the Blacksmith Forge, and maybe you're familiar with this little village where these buildings happen to be. Now also with demi-tasse, because demi-tasse cups are so small, demi-tasse spoons are also very small and pretty. And this is a beautiful little demi-tasse spoon marked 1907. It's silver. I like my coffee with a little bit of cinnamon and cream. The cookies, what do they taste like? Now I had to let the cookies dry out for another 8 hours before I could bake them properly. I had to go ahead for this video and use the ones that didn't quite make the grade. But you may wonder, what do they taste like? And to me, you know, they're very good. They're very good. In fact, they remind me of biscotti. They're very mild. They say that they keep for a long time. You can keep these cookies for weeks and weeks in the freezer, and they say they get better with time, like fruitcake. But what they taste like to me, they're rather soft in the middle, but a little bit crunchy on the outside, and they're perfect with coffee because they do taste, to me, like biscotti. They just have a very European cookie taste. So they're great to dip in your coffee or not. And I will let you know how those 24-hour cookies turned out in the next video. In the meantime, I hope you had a wonderful Valentine's Day. I know this video is going to be very late on Valentine's Day, but it's really a video for any time. So, hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time in Hopalong Hollow. Bye. And by the way, if you were given flowers for Valentine's Day, such as carnations, especially carnations, or roses, when these start fading away, do not throw them in the trash, because you can get some more life out of these beautiful cut flowers, and I'll show you how to do that next week.